Lesson 91. Why does French have personal endings? From the very beginning of this book, we've been telling you that the French language is a direct descendant of the Latin language. The ancient Romans took over what is now France. Back then they called it Gaul. That's G-A-U-L. The Latin word for Gaul was Gallia, G-A-L-L-I-A. Anyway, so after the Romans had occupied that land for so long, their language, Latin, came to be used all over France. And slowly, over hundreds of years, Latin gradually changed into French. So what this means is that the French language has a lot of linguistic leftovers from Latin. And those leftovers include vocabulary and especially the verb system. So we thought that it would be fun in this lesson to take a break from grammar and look at the way Latin slowly developed into French. So just for fun, you have to match the Latin word on the left with the French word on the right that later came from it. Let's start at the top with the Latin word mundus, which means world. Francois, what French word comes from mundus?
Monde.
So over time, the Latin word mundus lost its final S. Next we have panis, the Latin word for bread.
That's come into pain.
And the same thing here, the end of the word goes away and it gets shortened down to one syllable. Next we have the Latin word saeculum, which means age or century.
I think is siècle.
Again, we lose a syllable and the word is shortened. What about the word for friend in Latin, amicus?
Amicus, ami.
It looks like in French that the k sound really dropped off there, but in other Romance languages it sort of stay, like amigo in Spanish and Portuguese. In Italian it became amico.
Yes, exactly. So in Spanish, the word for friend is amigo, A-M-I-G-O, which is very similar to the Latin word amicus, except the C in amicus gets softened to a G sound in Spanish. And that's a very common pattern you see in Spanish words that derive from Latin words, a softening from C to G. Another common pattern I've noticed in words that go from Latin to Spanish is that the T sound often softens to a D sound. So two softenings from Latin to Spanish, C to G and T to D. Next we have the Latin word liber, which means book.
So we saw it is livre.
It's interesting that the B turned into a V in French, because I think in Italian it's a libro. It's also libro in Spanish.
It's a softening. Going from a B to a V is a softening of that sound. Next we have the word Ecclesia, which means church.
Becomes église.
Again, we have a softening of the C in Ecclesia to a G in Église, and a compacting of the syllables. We've lost one or two syllables. This word is actually Greek in origin. It comes from the ancient Greek word ekklesia, which means assembly. And also we have the Spanish word iglesia, which comes from the same word, and the Italian word chiesa. Next we have the Latin word tempus, which means time. We have related English words like temporary and temporal.
Becomes temps. T-E-M-P-S.
Now this is an interesting one to me because the French word temps is spelled very similarly to tempus. The only missing letter is the letter U that comes near the end of the word tempus. But in French pronunciation, all those consonants at the end have gone silent, and you just get a nasalized vowel. Next we have cor, which means heart. Related English words would be words like a coronary.
Corps becomes cœur. C-O-E-U-R.
Not too much of a pronunciation change, although we do have an additional vowel, the letter E, and also the letter U. Next we have corpus, which means body. In English we have words like corporation and corpulent.
So it becomes corps.
This is very similar to tempus. We just lose the U near the end, and then the consonants at the end of the word go silent. Next we have pax, P-A-X, which means peace in Latin.
Pax become P, P-A-I-X.
So again, we keep the consonant at the end there. We keep the X, but it goes silent. Lastly, we have the Latin word for death, which is mors, M-O-R-S, and the possessive form is mortis, M-O-R-T-I-S.
And in French, we have mort, M-O-R-T.
Those of you who are Latin students will notice that the word mors mortis in Latin is a third declension noun, and the derivative we get in French is based on the genitive stem, not from the nominative singular, which you might expect, but in my experience, most derivatives that come from a third declension Latin noun end up coming from the genitive stem.